A relentless presence stalked her through the dark, each step echoing like a countdown. Her pulse raced as she fled, the shadow behind her drawing closer, intent on ending the hunt. Just as the strike came, a flash of light split the air. A towering man, muscles taut, eyes glowing, stepped between them, halting the deadly blow mid-swing. His coat whipped in the cold wind, the girl frozen in disbelief behind him. Across the space, the faceless figure stilled, its mocking grin fading as it realized this time the prey had a protector, and the game had changed. It was close to midnight when I stepped off the bus outside a quiet Nevada town. The stop was deserted, just a cracked bench and a flickering street lamp. My backpack felt heavier than it should, the cold air pressing against my face. Across the road stood an abandoned motel, its sign hanging loose, creaking with each gust. I had to cross the parking lot to reach the only open diner, but my shoes slowed when I noticed a figure by the far corner, half hidden in shadow. His body seemed to waver, edges blurring, face pale as wax with black hollows where eyes should be. I thought about turning back, but the air grew denser, the ground brittle beneath my steps. He drifted forward without sound, his movements wrong, each step jerking like a broken film reel. Cold seeped into my skin until my breath came out in a thin white mist. I ran, but every glance over my shoulder showed him closer, his head tilting, black tears streaking down his cheeks. My feet pounded the cracked asphalt until I reached the motel's side door and shoved it open. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust and rain-soaked wood. My flashlight cut through the hallway, revealing peeling wallpaper and warped doors. Then a wall to my left rippled, and part of his body slid through, chest and face emerging from the plaster, as if the building itself birthed him. His gaze pinned me in place, and the sound of my own pulse drowned out everything else. I stumbled back, collided with an old vending machine, and the world warped. The walls stretched away, light bending, and I was no longer in the motel. I stood in a dim hallway lit by oil lamps, the floorboards uneven. Outside the cracked window, soldiers in ragged uniforms marched past, rifles on their shoulders. The apparition was here too, only now dressed in a scorched Union uniform, skin blackened in patches like burnt paper. His mouth opened, but no sound came, only a shiver in the air that pushed me toward the stairs. My heart thrashed as I took them, two at a time, but his shadow followed up the wall. At the landing, another figure stood, tall, broad, his long coat swirling though the air was still. His eyes glowed faintly blue, face calm yet unyielding. He stepped between me and the soldier, one hand lifting a massive shield that caught the blow I never saw coming. The impact sent a shock through the floorboards, dust drifting from the ceiling. The soldier hissed, his form fraying at the edges before pulling back into the gloom. The man turned to me, nodded once, then walked toward the open door at the end of the hall. I followed without thinking, my pulse still sharp in my ears. Outside, the street was gone. Instead, the sky burned red, and the air smelled of smoke and iron. In the distance, cannons thundered. When I blinked, I was back on the cracked bench at the bus stop, headlights of an approaching bus cutting through the dark. My hands shook, the night air no longer cold, but heavy with the memory of what had just happened. I walked toward the light, knowing the motel was still there behind me, and that somewhere inside, he was still waiting. I was never the kind of person to walk alone at night, but that evening felt harmless enough. The air was cool, the street quiet, and the glow from the nearby shop windows spilled onto the sidewalk. My friend Emily had stayed behind to finish her coffee, so I took the long way back to the bus stop. Every step echoed faintly, and I caught myself glancing at the glass fronts just to see my own reflection, like it could keep me company. Halfway down the block, the street lamps began to flicker. A shadow rippled against the far end of the street, stretching toward me in slow, deliberate movements. I told myself it was just another pedestrian, but the shape didn't walk like anyone I'd seen. Shoulders too sharp, stride too smooth, head tilting slightly as if it had already decided something. My pace quickened, my shoes scuffing the pavement in a rhythm that sounded too loud. When I turned the corner, the air shifted. The quiet deepened, like someone had drawn a curtain over the world. The buildings looked the same, but the sky had a faint green hue, and the traffic sounds were gone. My pulse climbed as I realized I couldn't hear Emily's laughter anymore, or the hum of the diner's sign. The shadow followed, steps steady, as if closing a gap measured in heartbeats. I ducked into an alley lined with old brick and ivy, hoping it would lead me back to familiar streets. Halfway through, I saw movement. A tall man leaning against the wall, his eyes fixed not on me, but on something behind. His presence was unsettling, but before I could speak, the shadow rounded the corner. The figure stepped forward, every line of his body whispering intent. A blur of motion broke the moment. Another man emerged from the far end of the alley, his stride purposeful, his coat sweeping the ground. His hand lifted in a smooth arc, and for a breathless second, the air around us seemed to harden. The shadow halted mid-step, the space between us charged like the moment before a storm. The tall man glanced back at me, and I realized his eyes were not just focused. They glowed faintly, as if reflecting a light I couldn't see. Without warning, the walls of the alley stretched upward, their bricks fading into smooth stone. The air thickened, scented with smoke and damp earth. I was standing in what looked like the hallway of an ancient fortress, torches mounted along the walls. Behind me, Emily appeared, her eyes wide, clutching her phone like it could anchor her. The shadow was here too, only now its form was draped in heavy tattered robes, the face hidden beneath a carved mask. The man in the coat moved to block its path, his stance calm but unyielding. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but the masked figure hesitated. I felt Emily's hand tighten on my arm, her breath ragged. My own heartbeat roared in my ears. We backed toward a wide wooden door at the end of the hall, each step slow, the floor creaking under our weight. The door gave way to a courtyard under a crimson sky. The air was warmer here, almost stifling. A young woman stood in the center, her dark hair tangled, her dress covered in faint ash. She looked at me as if she recognized my face, though I'd never seen her before. The man in the coat gestured for us to move, his attention still locked on the masked figure now emerging from the doorway. Emily and I crossed the courtyard quickly, but the woman didn't follow. She stayed where she was, lips moving silently, eyes darting between us and the man who shielded the exit. The masked figure's pace quickened, its robe trailing like smoke. The moment it reached the edge of the courtyard, the ground trembled beneath my feet. Light flared behind me, warm and blinding. When my vision cleared, I was standing on the sidewalk again, the faint hum of traffic returning in a rush. Emily was beside me, shaking her head like she'd just woken from a dream. The shop windows glowed, the bus stop sign swayed gently in the breeze, and a man in a long coat stood at the far corner, his gaze fixed on us for one quiet second before he turned and walked away. I didn't speak as the bus pulled up, but I knew the weight in my chest wasn't going to fade anytime soon. The street looked the same, the night felt calm again, yet the air carried the memory of a place I couldn't explain. I thought about the shadow, the masked figure, the woman in the courtyard. I thought about how easily the world could slip into another, and how thin the barrier between them might really be. I thought after that night, the strange haze between worlds would fade. For a few days, it almost felt like it had. The street was busy again. Emily was back to her usual chatter, and I even convinced myself the man in the long coat had been nothing more than an overactive imagination. But then the dreams began. They weren't chaotic or wild, just too vivid, as if I was walking through a place I'd already been. Stone corridors, the smell of wet ash, and voices that spoke in tones I couldn't understand. One morning, I woke with the faint trace of soot on my fingertips. I told myself it was just from an old blanket I'd pulled out of the closet, but the thought didn't settle. That afternoon, I met with Emily and her coworker Daniel at a small cafe. He was polite, a little quiet, but when our eyes met, I noticed the tiniest flicker of recognition in his expression, as if he knew exactly where I'd been without me saying a word. When we left, Daniel walked ahead toward the subway while Emily stopped to take a call. I stayed behind, distracted by the way the light on the sidewalk seemed to dim even though the sun was still out. The air thickened. I heard footsteps again, slow and steady, matching the rhythm of my pulse. I turned and saw her. A woman in a pale dress, standing perfectly still at the end of the block, her hair lifting slightly as though underwater. The street tilted. It wasn't dramatic, just a slow slide like the ground was giving way beneath my feet. I blinked, and the buildings shifted into the same fortress I'd seen before. The sky was dull silver this time, and the air held the faint hum of something alive but unseen. Ahead, Daniel was there, his coat dusted with ash, his eyes no longer mild but sharpened, watching the space over my shoulder. The woman in the pale dress stepped forward. Behind her, the masked figure emerged again, robes darker than before, each movement too precise, too measured. My breath caught as Daniel placed himself between us. His stance was calm, his head tilted just enough to catch the faint light that seemed to cling to him. Emily's voice cut through the air, calling my name, but she was nowhere in sight. From a side passage, another man appeared, older, with streaks of white in his hair and a steady gaze that didn't waver. At his side was a young woman holding a small leather book, her fingers tracing symbols along its cover. She looked at me like she'd been waiting for this moment, like my arrival here was inevitable. The masked figure slowed but didn't stop, its presence bending the space between us, making the air feel heavy in my lungs. Daniel's voice was low, but I caught fragments, warnings, instructions, maybe even names. The older man positioned himself near the woman with the book, his eyes darting between me and the shadowed figure. I took a step back, feeling the edges of the world blur around me. A faint wind swirled at my ankles, carrying the smell of something old, like rainwater trapped in stone. Then the hum grew louder, pressing at my ears until it felt like the walls themselves were trembling. The woman in the pale dress paused, her head turning slightly toward the masked figure, as if she too was caught in something she couldn't control. The young woman with the book whispered quickly, her voice almost drowned by the rising sound. The older man's hand brushed the air and the space between us rippled. The shift came suddenly. The fortress walls dissolved into gray mist, and I was standing under a bridge by the river. The city skyline glimmered in the distance, traffic moving steadily above. Emily was there, breathless, asking why I had run ahead. Daniel stood a few steps away, back in his street clothes, speaking quietly to a man I didn't recognize. Broad shoulders, weathered face, hands deep in his pockets. They both glanced at me, not with curiosity, but with the kind of look you give someone who's already in the middle of something they can't step out of. I wanted to ask who they were, what they knew, but the words stayed in my throat. We walked together toward the streetlights, and for a moment, the world felt stable again. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the pale-dressed woman was somewhere nearby, watching from just beyond the reach of the lamplight. And I knew, with a quiet certainty, that whatever door had opened for me wasn't closing anytime soon. I never meant to step away from the others, but curiosity can be a quiet trap. One moment we were near the bridge, and the next I was alone, the street fading behind me like a page turning without my consent. The air felt different here. Thicker, almost velvet soft, carrying a faint hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. When I looked around, the city had vanished, replaced by a forest of tall, silver-barked trees. They shimmered faintly in the dim light, as if reflecting a moon I couldn't see. Somewhere ahead, I heard voices, low and careful. I followed, unsure if I was trespassing or answering a call meant for me. The path curved, and I found them. Daniel stood near a pool of still water, speaking quietly to the older man I'd seen before. Across from them was a woman I didn't recognize, dark hair braided over one shoulder, eyes steady as they flicked toward me. She didn't smile, but there was something in her gaze that said she had expected me. The surface of the water rippled, though there was no wind. A faint outline began to form, a shape half submerged, motionless, almost like it was waiting to rise. I froze, my chest tight, as the masked figure stepped from the shadowed edge of the clearing. It didn't rush. Each movement was deliberate, measured, as if the distance between us was nothing more than a formality. Daniel shifted, his body angled protectively, but he didn't speak. The older man glanced at the woman with the braid, who placed the tips of her fingers over the pool. The water pulsed faintly, the ripples moving outward in slow, perfect rings. I had the strange sensation that the trees themselves were listening. The masked figure's attention was fixed on me now. I felt it in the weight of the air, in the way my pulse kept stumbling over itself. My feet wanted to move back, but something about the woman's calm presence kept me rooted. Her lips moved, whispering something I couldn't hear, and the reflection in the water began to shift. It was me, but not exactly. The version in the pool looked older, colder, with eyes that didn't blink. My throat tightened, but I couldn't look away. The reflection raised its head, and suddenly the masked figure paused, tilting slightly, as though it too was caught off guard. Daniel's voice cut through the tension, low, clipped, but urgent. The older man took a single step forward, his hand lifting as though to draw a curtain no one else could see. The air thickened, and for a heartbeat, the forest fell completely silent. Even my own breathing seemed to stop. The woman with the braid pressed her hand flat against the surface of the pool. The image shattered into silver light, spilling across the ground in curling streams. The masked figure stepped back once, then vanished into the tree line without a sound. My knees felt weak, but I forced myself to stand still until the last trace of that heavy presence was gone. No one spoke for a while. Daniel finally turned to me, his expression unreadable, but his eyes holding that same recognition I'd noticed the first time we met. The older man moved past us, vanishing into the deeper part of the forest as if he belonged there. The woman remained by the pool, her gaze distant, like she was listening to something far away. I wanted to ask what I had just seen, why my own reflection looked like a stranger, but the words felt clumsy in my mouth. Instead, I followed Daniel down a narrow path that seemed to weave back into itself. At times I thought I heard footsteps behind us, but when I glanced back, the path was empty. Eventually, the trees thinned and light spilled over us from a sky I recognized, soft blues and golds of late afternoon. The forest was gone. We were standing on a quiet street lined with houses, the scent of cut grass hanging in the air. It should have felt normal, safe. But the silence between us was heavy, and I could still feel the echo of that other world in my chest. Daniel looked at me like he wanted to speak but thought better of it. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, before walking away without a backward glance. I stood there for a long time, listening to the faint hum in the back of my mind, wondering if it would ever really leave. I didn't see him again for 2 days. In that time, I tried convincing myself nothing had happened, that the forest and the pool were just tricks of my own mind. But every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel the quiet weight of that place and the way the light bent differently around it. I told myself to focus on normal things, coffee runs, laundry, the little rituals that keep a day moving. On the third morning, the fog outside was thicker than usual, clinging to the houses like it didn't want to leave. As I stepped out, I noticed someone leaning casually against the fence across the street. He was tall, coat collar turned up, hair dark enough to almost blend into the mist. When our eyes met, it was like being yanked back into the forest all over again. I thought about walking the other way, but his voice stopped me, calm, almost conversational. He said there were rules I needed to understand, rules that weren't written anywhere I'd find. A woman joined him, stepping out from the side of a parked car. She had a quiet kind of presence, the type that made people turn to listen without knowing why. Her gaze flicked briefly over my shoulder before returning to me, like she was checking if something had followed. They didn't explain who they were or what they wanted. Instead, they asked if I remembered the sound beneath the silence that night in the forest. I told them I did, though I wasn't sure if I should admit it. The man nodded slowly, as if I'd just confirmed something important. The woman's hand tightened on the strap of the small leather bag she carried, her knuckles pale against the dark material. Before I could ask more, the air shifted. It wasn't wind exactly, but a change in pressure, like the sky leaning closer. From the corner of my vision, the street seemed to ripple. A figure emerged, not masked this time, but with eyes that caught the dim light in an unnatural way. He moved with a deliberate ease, his attention locked entirely on me. The man in the coat stepped forward, placing himself between us. His shoulders squared, and for a moment it looked like the air around him thickened, warping just slightly. The woman had already moved to my side, her voice low as she told me not to break eye contact with her. It felt strange, standing there in the middle of an ordinary street, with something in the air that didn't belong to this world pressing down on all of us. The figure stopped a few feet away, studying the man in the coat. There was no rush, no raised voice, just a quiet exchange of glances that felt heavier than any conversation I'd ever had. I felt my pulse in my fingertips, the rhythm fast and uneven. Somewhere far off, a single bird called, and then the sound cut sharply, like someone had closed a door on it. The man in the coat didn't move, but I could tell something had shifted in that invisible space between them. The figure's gaze slid past him, landing briefly on me before returning to the man. Then, with a slow step back, he faded into the mist until there was nothing left but the stillness. The street seemed too quiet afterward, the air too sharp in my lungs. The woman let out a slow breath, almost soundless. The man turned to me, his expression unreadable, but his voice carried a weight that made me straighten without thinking. He told me the space between places was thinner now, and that I had been seen, not just by them, but by others who wouldn't wait for another chance. I wanted to ask who those others were, but I knew by the look in his eyes that it wasn't something I was ready to hear. They didn't walk me home. They simply left, turning down the foggy street until their shapes were swallowed by the gray. I stood there longer than I should have, my thoughts restless, replaying every detail until I wasn't sure what I'd imagined and what had been real. The fog finally began to lift, revealing the familiar shapes of the neighborhood, but it didn't bring comfort. As I stepped back toward my door, I caught my reflection in the window. For a moment, I could have sworn it hesitated, just a fraction longer than I did, before following the movement. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving me to wonder if the rules they spoke of had already started working on me. I told myself that staying indoors for a while would help, but the truth is the walls didn't keep the unease out. It lingered in the corners, settled in the quiet between footsteps. Even in daylight, my thoughts wandered back to that morning in the fog, to the look in their eyes when they spoke about rules. I tried keeping busy, sorting old boxes in the attic, rearranging the plants by the window, making tea I barely tasted. At first, it worked. Then I began noticing little things, how the clock in the kitchen ticked out of rhythm for a few seconds before snapping back, how shadows shifted even when I stood perfectly still. They were details I would have ignored before, but now they stacked up in my mind like puzzle pieces I wasn't ready to put together. That afternoon, I heard a knock that didn't sound like any neighbors. When I opened the door, a man I hadn't seen before stood there. His hair was streaked with silver, his posture straight but not rigid. He introduced himself in a voice that carried an odd calm, and before I could invite him in, a second figure appeared. A woman with a sharp gaze, softened by a faint warmth. She said they had been asked to find me. We sat in the living room, the tea between us going cold. They spoke in turns, almost like they were passing the weight of the story back and forth. There were places, they said, where the fabric between here and elsewhere grew thin. The rules weren't written for people like me, yet somehow I had crossed into the edge of one. The man watched my face, as if measuring what I would accept. The woman's eyes moved subtly toward the hallway, and I wondered if she was checking for movement I couldn't see. I asked if the man in the coat was part of this. Their expressions didn't change much, but the silence that followed told me enough. They explained that once seen, I couldn't be unseen. It wasn't a threat, more like a fact I had to live with. The silver-haired man leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, as if what he was about to say could only be heard once. There were others, he said, who crossed for reasons far less patient than curiosity. A sound from outside drew all our attention at once. It wasn't loud, just a faint scrape, but it carried through the quiet like a thread, pulling us toward it. The woman was the first to stand, moving toward the window with a slow, deliberate step. She didn't touch the curtain, only tilted her head as though listening. Her shoulders eased after a moment, but she didn't look convinced. The man suggested I walk with them for a while. I almost refused, but something in the way the air felt inside my home made the decision for me. We stepped outside, the street washed in a pale gold light that didn't quite match the hour. As we moved, I noticed a third figure approaching from the far end of the block, a tall, lean man with an unreadable expression. The silver-haired man gave the faintest shake of his head, and the figure slowed, then turned into an alley without a word. We walked until the houses thinned, replaced by open ground and low brush. The woman pointed toward a cluster of old trees. She said this was one of the seams, a place where you could step wrong without realizing it. I felt an odd pull, like the air was thicker between those trunks. The man stood just behind me, his voice low, telling me to remember how this place felt under my skin. He said it was the only warning I might get. I asked if they were here to protect me. The woman glanced at the man before answering. "Not exactly," she said. "They were here to keep the balance from shifting too far. What happened to me was a side effect, one they couldn't fully reverse." Her words landed softly, but their weight stayed with me. By the time we returned to the street, the gold light had faded to an ordinary afternoon. They left without asking for anything, only reminding me not to go near the trees alone. I stood there until they disappeared from sight, the quiet settling in again like a familiar but unwelcome guest. Inside, I noticed the clock in the kitchen ticking normally, the shadows lying still. It should have been comforting, but instead it felt staged, like a scene put back in order after someone had been through it.